Okay, I want to talk about colonial ideology, the European and American ideologies that allowed for the colonization of Africa, big parts of Asia, etc., in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I want to talk in particular about how that ideology is encapsulated perfectly in one of the most racist books ever written, Tarzan of the Apes. So, to get into that, I want to first start way back. Coming out of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment is the 1700s, and the Enlightenment gives us all sorts of ideas about science and reason, etc. But coming out of the Enlightenment, there were really two ideas of human nature, and the Enlightenment hadn't decided on these two ideas of human nature. They favored one, but they really didn't deal with the other one, and they were both there. One of them was what we would call the mind-body split, the idea that human beings are made up of a sort of a biological machine, which is the body, and then this immaterial mind, this mind that has no physical presence but is rational and can evaluate the world, and it's connected to the body somehow, but it's not a physical biological thing, the mind. So that's one idea. It's the Cartesian dualism, or John Locke's dualism, if you will. The Enlightenment really embraced that idea. But on the other hand, the Enlightenment also had this strong tendency to want to study everything scientifically. And in particular, there was a strong urge in the Enlightenment to study human beings, to understand human society, human psychology, etc. And so the Enlightenment had a tendency to study human beings scientifically. And the more you studied human beings scientifically, the more some people began to say, hey, it really looks like human beings are biological animals. We are just like apes, only more complicated. We're not really different than biological animals. So maybe human beings are just entirely biological. Maybe there's no immaterial mind. There's just a biological brain in a biological body. Now, this idea was a little too radical for the Enlightenment, and they didn't have enough biological evidence in the Enlightenment to really make a go of it. So, the mind-body split, the dualism, was really the sort of standard idea coming out of the Enlightenment. And that actually is the idea that the U.S. Constitution is built around, and the European and American criminal justice systems and education systems, and all sorts of political voting, etc. All these things are built on this rational, disembodied mind. That each person is sort of a rational mind, not in a biological context. But that idea that human beings are just brains and bodies was still out there. And with Darwinism, it gets its huge boost, right? Now, Darwin actually comes up with his ideas in the 1820s and 30s, or actually 1830s, doesn't publish them until the late 1850s, and he doesn't actually connect his ideas to human beings explicitly until the 1870s with the Descent of Man. But once Darwin's ideas are out there in the 1850s or 60s, a lot of people seize on Darwin's ideas, and they recognize right away that Darwin's ideas provide a justification for the argument that human beings are just biological animals. We evolved from animals. We are no different than animals. We have more complicated brains, but we are basically just have a biological brain. There is no disembodied mind. And a lot of people began to take Darwin's ideas, and they get really excited about them. They began to run with them and say, this explains a whole lot about human society. And they didn't have the scientific evidence to make the claims they did. But they got really excited about the idea of Darwinian competition. Darwin says survival of the fittest, that minor variations between animals give one of them an advantage in survival, and so it has more offspring, and eventually the other type of animal dies out, and so evolution occurs. And evolution occurs through competition, and evolution shows some sort of progress. Now, I'll talk about a number of fallacies they made here in their reasoning, but they took Darwinism and they really got excited about it, and a lot of people did. In particular, a guy named Herbert Spencer was a sociologist, really wanted to explain all sorts of things about human society through Darwinian competition and evolution. And basically he said, upper class people are wealthy and successful because they are better, they're superior to lower class people because they are more evolved. And so Spencer really wanted to say that wealthy people were more evolved than poor people, which is why they were successful and wealthy. And in particular, he wanted to tie this to intelligence and say that wealthy people were smarter and wealthy people were more talented, etc. Well, it didn't take very long for Europeans to take these ideas of Darwinism, these ideas of applying Darwinism to human society, and apply it to justifying colonialism. And colonialism didn't need all this in the sense that Europeans were driven to colonialism for a lot of reasons, but a couple of the reasons were that they had gone through the Industrial Revolution. In the 1870s, they were going through a serious industrial slump, a depression. They needed, and it was a production glut. They were producing too much stuff, and they simply people couldn't buy enough. And so they were looking for markets, but they were also looking for cheap raw materials. And so given that, and the technological advances the Industrial Revolution had given Europeans, they suddenly found themselves in the late 1800s in a position to really go conquer huge swaths of the earth and to turn and economically exploit them by taking raw materials cheaply from those places and forcing them to buy finished European manufactured goods. And so in the 1870s, from the 1870s until World War I, Europe really engaged in sort of this colonialization spree. They colonized almost all of Africa. They colonized big chunks of Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands. They made inroads into China and China's markets. England solidified control of India. And France was involved, and Italy and Germany, and even Portugal still had colonies, although they weren't a major expansionary power at this point. But England and France were the two big ones. But they needed a way to sort of justify what they were doing, because Europeans at this point were also embracing Enlightenment ideas that that human beings are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and human beings are liberty and equality and fraternity from the French Revolution. These ideas about equality and human rights and things did not mesh with conquering Africa or Southeast Asia. And I should mention the United States was carrying out manifest destiny here and conquering most of North America, and then even moving into Pacific Islands also. And so how do you justify conquering all these people and exploiting them in the name, when you're embracing Enlightenment ideals, which are about justice and equality and human dignity and human rights? Well, this is where Darwinism sort of comes to the rescue. And what I'm going to talk about now is colonial ideology. This is the ideology that people use to justify colonizing Africa or manifest destiny across North America, etc. And these were ideas that were circulating in the culture. And it was very rare that you heard somebody articulate everything I'm about to say all in one coherent package. That was rare. Instead, there were 4 or 5 or 6 ideas that became sort of common knowledge that everybody accepted. And so you would hear some of these ideas, and they would show up as just sort of assumptions in newspaper articles or in government policies or in academic works. And so they were just assumptions that everybody sort of knew were true, and that weren't ever really examined carefully. And I'll point out, there's a lot of fallacies in here. So the colonial ideology came out of Darwinism in a couple ways. First of all, people made a big assumption, which is that races were biologically real. And by that I mean obviously there are people with different skin colors and different hair types and etc. But they made the assumption that those markers corresponded to some fundamental biological distinction between this group of people and that group of people. Now, biologists today will tell you that there aren't any, you can't really talk about races as discrete entities. There's too much bleeding between the different races, and people intermarry and have children, and instead race is more of a spectrum. And biologists would also tell you that the genes that code for skin color, hair color, etc., are such a minute portion of the human genome that it really tells you nothing important about the person. And two people who are different quote-unquote races could share almost all of the rest of their genes, and so they look different, but they're almost identical genetically otherwise. So race is not really meaningful in a biological sense. But the first fallacy colonial ideologies made was that they said races are real. Right? So they assumed you could talk about the black race and the white race and the Asian race and the Native Americans, or etc. And so they assumed that those races were real, discrete, coherent, self-contained, sealed-off entities. That's fallacy number one. The second fallacy they made was that they began to say, well, I talked about Herbert Spencer, who said, he thought there was competition in society and the upper classes were winning because, superior because they were winning because they're superior, and the lower classes were losing because they were inferior. People made a similar assumption about races. They assumed that if evolution is happening all the time, there's competition, survival of the fittest, and all that going on in biology, well, that must mean that between human races there is competition. And again, they're making human races into something real that is not. But they assume then that races are engaged in a competition, a struggle for survival of the fittest. This is their second fallacy. And so they see races as competing with each other. And because of they're thinking in terms of evolution, they think that competition implies that one of them is going to be evolving. So they see races evolving through competition between races. Right? Now, this leads to their third fallacy, which is that they think that certain races might be more evolved than other races. And you'll see all sorts of, if you go looking at racial science and scientific racism from the 19th century, you'll see all sorts of scientific theories by reputable scientists saying that Africans are less evolved than Europeans or etc., and trying to look at skull shapes and the angle of faces, or the whether skulls are round or whether they're more oval shaped, and they try to look at all sorts of markers to find evolutionary markings that one race is more evolved than another. This is a fallacy, right? Because if races aren't really biologically real and they're breeding with each other all the time, you can't really talk about them evolving distinctly. So talking about different races being at different levels of evolution is kind of nonsense. But they made another fallacy here also, which is that Europeans began to say, they said, well, how can we know that one race is superior to another one? And they began to basically say, well, races are in a struggle for survival. So if one race can conquer another one, that clearly means it's superior because it's winning the struggle for survival. And so Europeans began to say, well, if a race can conquer another race, they must be superior. And you can see where this is headed. White Europeans and white Americans start saying, well, if we can conquer another people, that shows that we are more evolved than they are, right? Because we have won the struggles for survival, so to speak. And again, this is all fallacious reasoning. And from this, well, it's obvious that Europeans are conquering Africa, and Americans are pushing, Native Americans off the land or onto reservations in North America, and the Europeans are conquering Southeast Asia, etc. They're doing it because their technology is better, right? They have steamboats, they have machine guns, they have, repeating rifles, they have telegraphs, they have railroads. And so Europeans then make another fallacious jump. They say, well, maybe if we're winning because of technology, and winning shows we're more evolved, then maybe evolution can be measured by technology, right? And this is really sloppy thinking, but it was a general assumption in Western culture that technology sort of was the mark of the high evolution of human beings over animals, and within civilizations, the one that had more technology must be more evolved, more advanced. Okay, there's another fallacy in here, which I don't have on my list here, which is that there's an assumption that evolution is a linear progress. Right? Now, Darwin would say that evolution is actually an adaptation to a particular environment. So, for instance, polar bears evolved to become white, and they have this fantastic fur that has fiber optic capabilities, etc. Polar bears are fantastic. They evolved to fit their niche in the Arctic. But if you took a polar bear and stuck it in a rainforest, it's not going to do as well. It's not adapted for that. And so a panda bear, for instance, might be much better evolved for a really warm, wet environment than a polar bear would be. But you put a polar bear in the Arctic and they're in trouble. Or you put a panda bear in the Arctic and they're in trouble. So neither polar bears nor panda bears are more evolved than the other. They have evolved to fit their particular niche, right? And that's all Darwin is saying, is that evolution, survival of the fittest, means more fit in a particular ecological niche and a better fit for a particular environment. But Europeans made a mistake here. And part of the mistake they made is because of capitalism. They assumed that winning competition, pushed one further along on some universal objective measure of progress, that there was a single track of evolution, and you were either ahead or behind on that track of evolution. There weren't different tracks, you weren't just going in different directions. You were either ahead or behind on this single track of progress or evolution. And so Europeans began to use technology to measure who was ahead and who was behind on this single track of evolution. Again, this is another fallacy they made, is the assumption that evolution equals progress and that evolution is linear. All right? Then they made one other big fallacious argument. There was a theory in the 19th century that was widespread amongst biologists and was accepted by many biologists as being absolutely true. And this was the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And what that means is basically, ontogeny is the word for the development of a single individual. So each adult human being has gone through the whole process of ontogeny. So the ontogeny is the creation of an individual from a fertilized egg through zygote and embryo, etc., fetus, and then child, and then adult. That's the process of ontogeny. And each individual goes through the process of ontogeny. Phylogeny is the process of evolution of a species. So the human race went through phylogeny, right? Or polar bears went through phylogeny. It's the generation of a phylum or a species, etc. So this is the process of evolution of the whole group. This is the process of the development of an individual. Scientists in the 19th century, many of them, thought that ontogeny was basically recapitulating or retracing phylogeny. In other words, they thought that a fertilized human egg going through the process of turning into an adult human being actually went through the exact same process that the human race had gone through from single-celled, blue-green algae up to being human beings. They thought that watching the development of a single human individual was like watching evolution on fast forward of the whole human race, the evolution of the whole human race on fast forward. And so they thought, and if you look at this very closely at the development of a human embryo, it does look like it gets gills for a little bit, and it does, they do kind of look like a fish for a little while, etc. And if you really want to squint and want to, make the argument, you could make that argument. It's not true, right? We now know that's not actually what happens. But they thought that's what happened. They thought that the development of each individual was a fast-forward rehearsal of all of human evolution. Now, what's interesting about this is if you put all this together, right? And again, very few people actually articulate this all as a whole set of ideas. Instead, each of these ideas was sort of circulating in popular culture and showed up in various ways, and they sort of hung together to form an ideology, but it was very rarely clearly articulated. But essentially, Europeans assumed that races were real, races were in constant competition for survival, and that this competition was driving evolution, and therefore some races might be more evolved than others on this single track of evolution. They might be ahead, and you could measure where you were on that track of evolution by your ability to conquer others, which really depended on technology. So technology was a measure of how far ahead or behind a particular race was on a single track of evolution. And here's where they sort of they misstate this. Because ontogeny, they think, recapitulates phylogeny, they think in sort of cultural terms, the sort of common cultural terms, that evolution is like growing up, right? Because growing up, they thought, recapitulated the entire process of evolution. That means evolution must be like growing up. And so this comes up then with this sort of coherent idea that Europeans and European descendants in America and Australia, etc., are superior to other races, they think, because they think they're farther ahead on the path of evolution. They think there's a single track of evolution, so you can measure who's ahead and who's behind. And they think you can measure that in terms of technology, and they say, oh yes, we're clearly ahead in technology. And they think that this metaphorically is like growing up. So Europeans are like adults, and other races, they think, are like children, right? And again, these are all fallacies in reasoning, right? This means that Europeans came up with a sort of a justification for colonialism based on these ideas. They basically said, hey, look, all the races are in competition, and some are farther ahead in terms of evolution. You can measure that by technology, and we have the best technology. So we are clearly the farthest ahead on evolution, and we can conquer them, which shows we're superior, we're winning the survival of the fittest, which means we are more evolved. And evolution is like growing up, which means we're like adults, and all those other people, and they really meant everybody else in the world, is like children to us, right? Now, a reasonable, responsible adult wouldn't let children run around unsupervised. And so Europeans have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, as the only evolutionary adults, to go and raise these other peoples, to bring them along, to bring European civilization and technology to these other races of people and guide them through the process of evolution so that they too can be more evolved. Right? In French, they call this the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. In English, they call it, Rudyard Kipling encapsulated this in the poem White Man's Burden, which he wrote in 1898 or something, don't quote me on the date, to try to convince the American public to support conquering the Philippines. He wrote this poem called White Man's Burden, and it really encapsulates this idea, right? He says, take up the white man's burden, and he's talking to white Europeans and Americans, and he's saying, you have this burden to go out and discipline these children, and he calls them half devil and half child, and he says you have to send your young out there to do this noble mission to bring civilization to these benighted people, but they're children, they're going to throw tantrums, they're not going to like it, so you have to be stern with them. And he makes it sound as if colonialization is just a reluctant responsibility that Europeans and Americans have to take up because of their adult status. What he's justifying is blatant colonial exploitation. And again, there are all sorts of fallacies in this line of reasoning, so it really is bad reasoning. But it provided the cover, it provided the intellectual justification, and it shaped the culture in such ways that the European publics, French public, English public, Italian or German or whatever, and the American public supported these colonial conquests. And they often justified it in these terms. They might take part of this out, they might take all of it. You don't know. But what's kind of interesting is that virtually all of this shows up in Tarzan of the Apes. Now, Tarzan of the Apes is one of the most successful books in human history. It was published in 1913 by an American. And it basically, the basic gist of the story, and I want to point out, this was pulp fiction. This was sold basically to teenage boys. It was cheap pocket books, pocket paperbacks that you could carry with you, and you could buy them at the drugstore. And this thing was fantastically successful, and he wrote 20-some sequels to the novel. There were movies, there were TV shows. Tarzan was a huge part of American and European culture, especially American culture. And Tarzan sort of perfectly encapsulates all of this stuff. Tarzan, first of all, the gist of the story is there's these two aristocrats, Lord and Lady Greystoke, who have been sent to the Belgian Congo, which is a Belgian colony in Africa, to investigate abuses by the Belgians of the local population. On the way there, however, the ship they're sailing on, there's a mutiny. The sailors are these sort of working class tough guys who are not very smart, and they're pretty bloodthirsty and violent. They kill the captain and the captain's mates and all the officers in the ship, and they take control of the ship. But Lord Greystoke, defending his wife, shows such bravery that they decide they're not going to kill these two. Instead, they just drop them off on the coast of Africa. They're in the middle of the jungle on the coast of Africa. There, Lord Greystoke builds a cabin with a lock and everything for his wife, and the wife gets pregnant, and they have a baby, but then he gets killed by an ape, and then she goes crazy, or she dies first, and then he gets killed by an ape. But the longest short of it is that the baby gets left alone in the cabin. Well, a bunch of apes, and the apes are kind of semi-intelligent, stop by, and one of them has just had her baby killed by the brutal leader of the ape group, and so she takes the baby as her own, the human baby as her own. Names him Tarzan. He gets raised by the apes. He thinks he's an ape. He learns all ape stuff. But then one day he breaks into his parents' cabin. The apes couldn't break into the cabin because it had a lock on the door. And the lock locked after they left it, taking Tarzan with them. So the cabin sat there untouched until Tarzan figured out as a teenager how to pick the lock and get into the cabin. And then Tarzan discovers all these books. He teaches himself how to read. He finds a knife that his father had. And so he takes the knife and he goes back and he uses the knife to challenge the head of the apes to a sort of a fight, and he kills him in a fight. And he becomes the Lord of the Apes, okay, because he's got this knife. Then, one day, a bunch of black African human beings show up, and one of them kills Tarzan's ape mother, and he decides he's going to take revenge on the human beings. Now, when he first sees them, he's thinking, oh, cool, these are people like me, but then he decides he hates them. And he kills several of them. He plays practical jokes on them. He sort of becomes terrorizes them in the jungle. But he also takes from them the knowledge of how to make rope and do lassos and bows and arrows. Right? So he learns and he learns how to wear clothing from them. Then a little while later, a bunch of other people show up on the coast. Now what's happening is that there were a bunch of Europeans who were traveling somewhere, and their crew on their ship mutinies and kills all the captain and the officers, but they like these people, so that the passengers, so they drop them on the African coast in the exact same spot that Tarzan's parents had been dropped off. There was a young English aristocrat named John Clayton, who was Lord Greystoke, and then there's Jane Porter and her father and his secretary, etc. And they are helpless in the face of the jungle. They don't know how to live in the jungle, and so but a bunch of French soldiers show up to try to save them. But long story short, Tarzan at first sees the European sailors. And he's like, ooh, I'm like these people, I like these people. Then he sees they're really violent and stupid and he doesn't like them. But then he sees the passengers who have been dropped off, Porter and John Clayton and Jane Porter, his daughter. And he likes them. In fact, he falls in love with Jane. Well, they get into all sorts of trouble. He saves them from wild animals in the jungle. And then he saves them from the black Africans who are cannibals. And then but ultimately, the Porters go back to Europe and then the United States, and Tarzan gets left in the jungle with this French officer, Darnaud. And so they have to but Tarzan decides to get Darnaud home, so they basically make this massive trek from sub-Saharan Africa up to presumably Morocco or Algeria. He gets Darnaud home, and while Darnaud is there, he does some research, and he had taken one of the books from Tarzan's parents' cabin, and he took it back to France, and he has the fingerprints on the book examined, and he shows that the book was owned by Lord Greystoke and Lady Greystoke, and therefore Tarzan is the child of Lord and Lady Greystoke, and he figures out who Tarzan is, and he says, oh, you're an aristocrat. Well, Tarzan isn't really interested in being an aristocrat. Instead, he wants to find Jane Porter again, so he tracks her down in Wisconsin. And he winds up saving her from a forest fire in Wisconsin. And he asks her to marry him right at the end of the book. All right? Now, you might say, well, what's all this have to do with all this colonial ideology? Well, the fact is that built into this story are a number of ideas taken from colonial ideology. First of all, if you watch what happens to Tarzan, Tarzan basically thinks he's an ape. And then he finds the black Africans and he thinks he's a black African. But then he realizes he doesn't like them. And then he finds the white European sailors who are lower class white Europeans, and he thinks he's like them, but then he realizes he's not. They're stupid and they're violent. But then he meets the middle class Porters and the aristocratic John Clayton, and who incidentally is Tarzan's cousin. And he says, these are my people. Right? And he actually says that in so many words in the book. These are my people. At last he had found his people. And what's interesting is that the author very clearly makes it apparent that he sees Tarzan evolving. that basically as Tarzan grows up, he goes through human evolution. Ontogeny is recapitulating phylogeny. Tarzan at first thinks he's an ape, then he thinks he's a black African, then he thinks he's a lower class white European, then he thinks he's an upper class white European. So Tarzan has actually added in a class hierarchy. And this was also an idea that circulated amongst Europeans, was that upper class people were more evolved than lower class people. So now Tarzan basically has gone through this process of evolution. And what's interesting, though, is that what the author is doing is he's trying to convince you that Tarzan, by growing up, has gone through the process of evolution. But what he's doing, without saying it, is smuggling in the idea that evolution means going from ape to black African to lower class white European to upper class white European. He's smuggling in the idea that that's the stages of evolution by telling you Tarzan is going through evolution and then showing you those stages. Now, you might say, I'm reading too much into this. Well, it's sort of not. I mean, at the beginning, when Tarzan breaks into his parents' cabin and he starts to read, the book talks about him as being a perfect allegory of the primordial groping through the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge, and and makes it sound a lot like that. And then when he kills a black African and he steals his clothes, he says he wanted clothes as a mark of his evolution. And then later, I mean, there's all sorts of language like that. And they even bring in things like phrenology and head shape and whatever, that, Tarzan is a perfectly shaped skull and things like that. But what's really kind of fascinating is that Tarzan marks every stage of his evolution with a new technology. Right? When he gets the knife from his father's cabin, he takes over and becomes Lord of the Apes. Then, when he finds the Africans, he gets clothes and lassos and bows and arrows. Then when he finds the white Europeans, he discovers guns and he uses writing for the first time. And then when he finally gets to the upper class Europeans, he's doing, fingerprint analysis. He's driving a car, for goodness sake, in Wisconsin. And so Tarzan basically is marking every stage of his evolution with a technology. And he even comes close to saying this at the end. At the end, he's talking to the Frenchman, Darnaud, and he says, I don't understand why you guys think human beings are superior to all the animals, because Sabor the lion could kill 1,000 of you, Darnaud. You're helpless in the jungle. And Darnaud says, that's true, but you're going to think a whole lot more of us when you see our technology, right? You'll think more of your race when you see its technology. And so Darnaud is explicitly saying, what sets human beings off from animals is the technology. And Tarzan, as he goes through his evolution, finds new technology at every stage. And at the end of the book, Tarzan finds Jane. He's gone from the African jungle all the way across Africa and then across Europe, and he finds her in Wisconsin. And he says to her, he finds her and he saves her from a forest fire. And the first thing he says is not, I came all the way from Africa to find you. He says, I came across eons to find you. Right? He came across all the stages of human evolution to get to her. Right? And so in the end, what Tarzan is a fantasy. It's a colonial fantasy. It's a fantasy of colonial ideology. All these bad ideas that were built into colonial ideology are there in Tarzan. And Tarzan basically, the message is sort of this, that you, white European or American middle-class boy, you are superior to everybody else. If somebody took you and dropped you all alone as an infant into the jungle, you would not only survive, you would dominate the jungle, you would dominate all the other inferior peoples, and you would turn into this amazing godlike person. And you as you grow up, you would be evolving, and your sort of natural claim is to be the most evolved because you are white and middle class and male and European or American, right? So Tarzan really sums up this ideology, and the ideology, built on a whole bunch of bad reasoning, is tended to justify why the Enlightenment rules of equality, liberty, justice, human rights, etc. don't apply. And basically the answer is because evolution. Because whites are supposedly more evolved than everybody else, and that justifies, and because evolution is like growing up, that justifies white people treating all the other people in the world as children and taking them over and quote-unquote disciplining them. So ultimately, colonial ideology is built on a whole bunch of bad ideas taken from evolution. But those were sort of necessary because European and American culture was filled with Enlightenment ideas about human rights and equality, And if you're going to conquer Africa, you're going to conquer Southeast Asia, you're going to conquer the rest of North America, you have to have a reason for why you can take over all these other people to do that. Colonial ideology furnished that.